Hi everyone, Æfterra here, one angry pagan. Right. Well, it's the first PMQs of the year, and obviously I was going to do a reaction video for it. Still trying to get the Selfie Ridge, the second parts of the Selfie Ridge video up, so do apologise on that one. And yeah, here we go. Oh, there's a little bit of... I found something. I was watching Sky News, and the bit before before PMQ started, and Andrew Bridgen has had the whip removed.
Over the last couple of hours from the US that reports suggested all flights had been grounded after the FAA said that the system that alerts pilots and other flight personnel about hazards or any changes to airport facility services was not processing information, and as a result many flights were grounded. We've just had an update from the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. They are saying that the FAA is working to restore its notice to air missions system. We are performing final validation checks and reloading the system now. Operations across the national airspace system are affected. We will provide frequent updates as we make progress. That was about 10 minutes ago from the Federal Aviation Administration, essentially confirming that story officially, that their systems are down, flights severely affected as a result, and we will update you when we get more on that. Let's pivot back to the other breaking news story of the last couple of hours closer to home. The breaking news that Andrew Bridgen has had the whip removed. We had that confirmed by the chief whip earlier today. Let's bring in Liz Bates again, just for further reaction to that and just a reminder of how this all unfolded.
Well, we have had a bit...
What's really quite funny as well, Andrew Bridgen was one that we saw a lot come out, defend Boris Johnson. I've seen him on LBC, Ian Dale's 8 o'clock show. I've seen him on loads, on BBC Politics Live. I've seen him everywhere. And now this. I think it's absolutely hilarious.
A bit more reaction to that. It's all just happened in the last hour or so. The original tweet, of course, from Andrew Bridgen, he said, as one consultant cardiologist said to me, this is the biggest crime against humanity since the Holocaust. He was referring to the COVID vaccination programme, so attributing it to someone else. But there was a huge backlash, as you can imagine, to that tweet. One of those people immediately responding was his colleague Simon Clarke. He was, of course, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, briefly Secretary of State under Liz Truss. He simply said, this is disgraceful. Quite quickly after that, we had a response from the Chief Whip. I won't read out the whole statement, but what he said was, Andrew Bridgen has crossed the line. I'm therefore removing the whip from him with immediate effect, pending a formal investigation. So we still don't know whether Andrew Bridgen will have the whip restored. He is currently not a Conservative MP. Incidentally, he was already suspended from the House of Commons for something different. He had broken rules on lobbying. The Standards Committee had said that he had been careless and cavalier with the rules when declaring a financial interest. So he was currently suspended for 5 days from the Commons anyway.
Great stuff, Liz Bates. Thanks so much for that. It would typically be a topic, of course, that might then suddenly top the list of questions posed to the Prime Minister in Prime Minister's Question, which, as a reminder, is due to start in about 15 minutes' time. We'll have that live in the Commons at midday, as and when it does begin. It is the first of the new year, and many of 2022's old problems are still there on the Prime Minister's in tray, with strikes right at the forefront of the public's mind today. Let's preview what we might expect in PMQs. I'm joined by Caroline Dinenage, the Conservative MP for Gosport, Liz Kendall, the Labour MP for Leicester West and Shadow Minister for Social Care, and Wendy Chamberlain, the Lib Dem MP for Fife North East and the party's Chief Whip. A very good morning to you all, and big day coming up, first of the year. I was going to have some broad questions initially in terms of what we might expect to be the key topics to focus on, but there's so much news just individually today. Liz, coming to you first. What should be the number one topic and angle of attack from your leader?
I'm absolutely sure the NHS will be front and centre in Prime Minister's questions, not just the urgent need for ministers to sit down and do a deal with the unions to end these strikes, but I'm afraid the crisis that we currently face, the sheer number of people waiting hours in A&E, the long waits for hospital operations, the elderly people stuck in hospital who don't need to be there. People have always believed that the NHS will be there for them when they need it, but we have seen over this last decade a failure to put the investment or the reforms in. And even Edward Lee, the Conservative MP, said in the health statement on Monday that the Tories have no long-term plan. Why is it only Labour has a long-term plan, which we do, for investment and reform and the biggest expansion ever of the workforce? We desperately need the root causes of this problem to be sorted, for the strikes to be over, for a negotiation to be done, and for the government not to be putting forward this legislation which won't deal with the underlying problems in the NHS.
Live pictures there of Parliament as we wait that. Caroline, the longer the strikes go on, does it come back into your favour more, these strikes versus the strikers themselves?
Well, I don't think strikes are in anybody's favour, are they? Because, it's impacting everybody's daily life. It's impacting people's ability to be able to get the care and health support that they need. It's impacting people's ability to get to hospital in an emergency. No one wants this to be the situation. But of course, this is a situation that needs to be resolved. And I think people are very well aware of the fact that, in particular, our health services, our paramedics have done a remarkable job over a considerable period of time. It's why, in fact, they were given pay rises during the pandemic when the rest of the public sector workers' wages were frozen and inflation was at 0%. So,
it wasn't actually a pay rise.
It does care deeply and does massively appreciate the work of those people. And I think
still down.
It's in everyone's interest to bring this to an end as quickly as possible.
Broadening it out just from the health sector, sticking with you on this one, Caroline, we heard from Mick Lynch earlier today, who said specifically that the government's on a campaign to drive poverty into our communities, based on their approach to these negotiations, and suggested that the strikes in his sector over the Christmas time was something that the government purposefully wanted to go ahead. What's your response?
Again, I think it's crazy to suggest that any government would want to bring this country to a standstill. In fact, the only governments that want to bring this country to a standstill are foreign nations who want to undermine us, rogue nations that want to undermine us, and I'd be looking at that if I was them. The fact is that some of these pay requests are just completely unaffordable. They drive inflation into the pockets of the people.
I don't know why the Tories keep doing this. It's been proven now that wages aren't driving inflation. So I don't know, what's the point in carrying on with it?
In the country that can least afford it, and many of whom are not looking, many of whom are working for private sector companies, are not looking at inflation-busting pay rises and just simply can't afford to face the rising cost of living that will be generated by eye-watering sums of money being paid in addition to rail workers.
Wendy, one of the stories to come out of the the Transport Committee hearing this morning was a suggestion that the anti-strike legislation from the government has made the negotiations worse. It's certainly soured the tone. What's your party? What's the Lib Dems' position on that?
Well, I think what I would say is that, in agreement, I think where we are in an agreement as MPs is that the strikes are benefiting nobody. And certainly from a Scottish perspective, we are experiencing rail strikes. From an NHS perspective, they've not come yet, but they are coming, and our NHS in Scotland is already in crisis too. But in relation to rail, I think the issue with minimum standards is that they should be done or agreed collaboratively. And indeed, you've seen that in relation to the ambulance strikes, where there's been local agreements with trusts in relation to what people will come out for. But what this looks like is a sledgehammer to crack a nut from the government. It looks punitive, it looks aggressive, and it suggests that why would anybody want to come round the table with a government that is proposing legislation in that manner?
Exactly.
There's clearly strikes and the health services we mentioned will be high on the list in PMQs today. But it is also the first one of the year. Last year was certainly not a bad year for your party.
Yes, I'm doing the bit before it. I was going to fast forward it, but I do like to get some of the hear what the MPs or whoever's there saying beforehand.
In the polls, a lot of that was errors, understatement of the century from the opposition. Is this
not cannabis, tobacco? Kids don't smoke. I don't care. I'm not getting monetized for this. So
now a year where your leader has to step up and make further gains because of positive performances himself?
I think it's also the case that people have looked again at Labour and see that we've changed. They see that we are strong on national security, that we love our country, that we believe in NATO and our armed forces, that we are stamping out anti-Semitism in our party. They see Keir Starmer has changed the Labour Party. Now they want to hear, what's your plan for the future? I've already talked about our long-term plan to have the biggest ever expansion of the NHS workforce. We have a plan on energy security, so we're not so reliant on Russia, so we get that clean energy by 2030 and bring bills down. Our plan to grow the economy, I think that is where the focus will be this year, to scrap business rates, transform skills and make Britain the best place to start up and grow a business. People want to know our solutions. And for me, Keir Starmer's speech, his New Year's speech, which says we've got to stop the sticking plaster approach to politics. We've got to get to the root cause of the problems. Give children the best start in life, prevent crimes from happening in the first place, as well as tackling criminals. Get to those root causes and have a long-term plan. That's what the public want. Everything seems so dire at the moment. Things we used to take for granted, getting from A to B, seeing your GP, having your schools open all week. It seems like the basics can't happen, and Labour has got to prove we have a programme that can really improve the country, that's realistic, fully costed and affordable, and that's what we're focusing on this year.
Caroline, what about your leader's performances in the year ahead in PMQs? His first few months in position, often framed as answering with more detail than his predecessor, but sometimes not the same charisma and charm, something that many newspapers are writing about the former Prime Minister following his appearance at the Carlton Club last night. Are you missing that as a party?
No, I'm really not missing any form of charisma or charm. What I think we need, what the country needs, is serious, sober leadership at a very, very difficult time. Not just a difficult time for us, a difficult time for the rest of the world as well. And I think Rishi has, started out the year, like Keir Starmer, he set out his speech, his 5 priorities for the year: cutting inflation, cutting hospital waiting lists, reducing the national debt, tackling the small boat crisis, and of course growing the economy, which is fundamental to all of it. I guess in my constituency, which is not a sort of metropolitan London one, it's right out there in the real world. I think people are, the jury is very much still out on Keir Starmer. Mine's an area that has very strong links to the armed forces. They saw him hand in hand with Jeremy Corbyn in the last general election, and that's a reputation that will take a while to overcome. I think they understand that Rishi offers sensible, sober leadership, and this is a time when we really, really need to focus on that.
Beth Rigby joins me on set now as well, our political editor. And Beth, first one of the year, even though it's only the 11th of January, I think it is, but it feels like we've already had many months worth of news. There's lots of
news. It does, doesn't it?
Yeah. What are you going to be focused on?
Well, look, I think if last week was the week in which both leaders set out their visions, if you like, for Britain, I think this PMQs is going to be very much about the reality of what's going on right here, right now with the health service. And Keir Starmer has so much to go on today, and I imagine that the Labour leader will go straight in on the NHS. 2 big issues: ambulance strikes today, 25,000 ambulance workers striking, 10 out of 11 trust. The Health Secretary warning about disruption. There's also those ONS figures out this week about excess deaths in the UK, 50,000 excess deaths in total above normal in the 2022. That's the highest level, barring the 2 years of pandemic, since 1950.
51. And why is it happening? There's lots of reasons, but part of it, experts are saying, is down to NHS wait times and blockages in the system and ambulance issues and so on and so forth. So for Keir Starmer, that Rishi Sunak laid out his plans to try and cut waiting lists. It was actually a rehash of things the government have already announced, but that's kind of non-elective waiting list. But there's an acute crisis at the moment in the health service, and I imagine he's going to have very difficult questions that the Lib Dems have actually already asked for an investigation by the Care and Quality Commission on the matter of that excess deaths number for 2022.
Before we wrap up this discussion, we do just want to bring you some more on that breaking news. 5 minutes or so to go until the start of PMQs. That all flights, as we learnt earlier, across the United States were grounded a little earlier today due to a glitch with the Federal Aviation Administration's computer system. Flights are now resuming. Let's get an update from our US correspondent Mark Stone, who's in Washington at Reagan, obviously for those in the US, to those strikes over the Christmas time. Let's now listen in to Prime Minister.
There we go.
There are no NHS dentists taking on patients in Lancaster and Fleetwood, and for those constituents of mine lucky enough to have one, they're waiting months for an appointment. So can I ask the Prime Minister how long he had to wait for his last NHS dentist appointment?
He doesn't use the NHS.
Mr. Speaker, as a result of the new reformed NHS dentistry contract, there are now more NHS dentists across the UK with more funding, making sure people can get the treatment they need. But Mr. Speaker, let me...
hang on a minute. I want two different lists when it comes to dentists, right? And periodically I check up. I don't do it every week or every month. It's every couple of months, right? Still nothing. And I checked only a couple of weeks ago. I need to get my teeth done. Two discs, a specialist and a general dentist, and nothing. So what the fuck is this guy talking about?
Correctly, I am registered with an NHS GP. I have used independent healthcare in the past. I'll answer her question. I am registered with NHS GP. I have used independent healthcare in the past, and I'm also grateful to the Friarage Hospital for the fantastic care they've given my family over the years. But the truth is, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to come from an NHS family, and that's why I'm passionately committed to protecting it with more funding, more doctors and nurses, and a clear plan to cut the waiting list.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You are 24 times more likely to become a doctor if a parent is a doctor, 17 times more likely to become a lawyer if a parent is a lawyer, and there is a lower proportion of disadvantaged young people being admitted to degree-level apprenticeships by employers than to degrees by universities. So I warmly welcome what my right honourable friend set out last week about education and family, but does he agree with me we also need our universities, employers and professions playing their part to improve social mobility in the UK?
Well, Mr. Speaker, everyone should have the opportunity to succeed, and my honourable friend is absolutely right that we all have a part to play. That's why I'm pleased the Social Mobility Commission is working to provide new information to young people about the opportunities available to them, but also a toolkit for employers so that they can also play their part in improving social mobility.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
It's funny, the Tories don't even believe in social mobility. I don't like it. They try to conserve things. It's in their name. Therefore, social mobility doesn't help that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the 13 years of the last Labour government, there were no national NHS strikes. If the Prime Minister had negotiated with the nurses before Christmas, they wouldn't be on strike. If he'd negotiated with the ambulance workers, they wouldn't be on strike either.
Bang on.
So why is he choosing to prolong the misery rather than end these strikes?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we've always been clear that we want to have constructive dialogue with...
It's complete bullshit. That's complete bullshit. That was a great way to start off from Starmer.
Unions, that is also why, when it comes to the issue of pay, we have accepted in full the independent recommendations.
And the unions have rejected it. Because it's not fair. So fuck you, you sneaky bastard.
The pay review bodies. But now the honourable gentleman simply doesn't have a policy when it comes to this question. If he talks about wanting to end the strikes. The question for him is simple then. Why does he not support our minimum safety legislation?
Because it goes against workers' right to strike. Not only that, but, you know, a lot of these places regulate themselves. A lot of these people going on strike are regulating themselves, especially emergency workers. Is his argument just false pieces?
We all know why. We all know why, Mr. Speaker. It's because he's on the side of his union paymasters, not patients.
It's funny. Starmer's pissed off a lot of the unions. And perhaps this was the reason why. So when the Tories tried doing this, like Sunak's doing here, he's like, what? You think the unions are in a great mood with me? Well done.
Mr. Speaker, when I clapped nurses, I meant it. His response to the greatest crisis in the history of the NHS is to threaten to sack our nurses. His Transport Secretary says it's not the solution. His Education Secretary hopes it won't apply in schools. His own assessments say it could increase the number of strikes. The simple truth is you can't legislate your way out of 13 years of failure. Between 2010 and 2019, before anyone had heard of COVID, Prime Minister, the number of people stuck on the NHS waiting list doubled. Why do patients always wait longer under the Tories?
What? This is the new year. I want to start off with the refreshed chamber, but certainly not by interruption. Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, he talks about the minimum safety legislation. Let's just talk about it a little bit further, because this is a simple proposition that no one denies the union's freedom to strike, but it is also important to balance that with people's right to have access to life-saving healthcare.
Then why have you been crushing it for the last 13 years, you fuck?
At the same time, Mr. Speaker, this shouldn't be controversial. This shouldn't be controversial. The International Labour Organization supports minimum service levels. We have, they're present in France, in Italy, in Spain. Normally, he's in favour of more European alignment, Mr. Speaker. Why not now?
Mr. Speaker, they've gone from clapping the nurses to sacking the nurses. It's that simple. And to add insult to injury, they're the cause of the crisis. His government commissioned a report on waiting times. He knows this. His own report says this is not a COVID problem, it's 10 years of managed decline. As a result, 7.2 million people are now waiting for treatment. He says he wants to be held to account over that. So let's be very clear. Is his promise merely to get those numbers back to where they were before COVID, that's 4.6 million, or back to where Labour had them in 2010, almost half of that? Which is it?
Mr. Speaker, again, let's just start with the facts. The honourable gentleman seems to completely ignore the fact that not just in England, but in Scotland and in Wales and in many other European countries, COVID has had an extraordinary impact on health services. Now we
Starmer wasn't denying that. He's saying that the original reason as to why this is such a problem isn't the pandemic. the pandemic exposed the problem, helped to further expose the problem.
Have a very clear plan to bring the waiting list down, and it's one that the NHS supports. But I tell you what the NHS doesn't need. What they don't need is Labour's idea. What they don't need is Labour's only idea, which is for another completely disruptive, top-down, unfunded reorganisation buying out every single GP contract. Now, these aren't my words, Mr. Speaker. The CEO of the Nuffield Trust said it will cost a fortune and it's out of date, just like the Labour Party.
Mr. Speaker, so he can't tell us how much he'll reduce waiting lists by or when. So much for accountability that he wants. As ever with this Prime Minister, you scratch the surface and you find there is nothing there. Last month, 1.4 million people waited more than 4 weeks for a GP appointment. When Labour left government, you were guaranteed an appointment in 2 days. When does the Prime Minister expect to get back to that?
Well, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to waiting lists, we've already eliminated 2-year wait lists done last year. We're on track. We're on track.
No, you haven't eliminated it at all.
This spring.
That's bollocks. That's actual bollocks. He needs to be pulled up for the same thing Boris has been pulled up for.
To eliminate those waiting 18 months, with a clear plan to go further, to eliminate those waiting 52 weeks by next spring. And we're doing that with record funding, more community diagnostic centres.
He says record funding, but it's not enough. It's not kept up with the increase in the population. It's not kept up with the increase in the problems that people are having because of the lack of funding over a decade. One batch of funding isn't going to help unless it's really substantial, which actually isn't as substantial as the Tories are making out.
More surgical hubs and more patient choice. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, I've made tackling wait lists one of my 5 priorities. But what are his? They seem to change every single week. But first, he was against NHS outsourcing. Now, he's apparently in favour of it. He's inconsistent, unprincipled, and in hock to his youth.
I wonder if Order. Can I just remind the Prime Minister, it's Prime Minister's questions, opposition questions. Here's Farmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I heard the Prime Minister saying he's now registered with an NHS doctor, so he'll soon enjoy the experience of waiting on hold every morning at 8 a.m. to get a GP appointment. But I can tell him that those that are waiting now don't want another round of empty promises or boasting about what he's done. They just want to know when they'll be able to see a doctor. And this is not just about routine care. There could be nothing more terrifying than being told you might have cancer. That's why the last Labour government brought in a guarantee you'd been seen by a specialist within 2 weeks. Today, 50,000 people are waiting longer than that. 50,000. And everyone in this House will appreciate the anxiety that they're feeling. So when will cancer patients once again get the certainty of quick care that they got under Labour?
Mr. Speaker, why is there a challenge with cancer times right now? I tell you, again, it's just absolutely no understanding of the situation, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, it is rich coming out of your mouth, you fucking smug cunt.
What happened to cancer referrals during COVID? They went down by almost 2/3, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah, and I wonder why.
That was because of a pandemic that they went down.
Right. These numbers were a problem before the pandemic. The Tories are refusing to accept this as an actual fact, even though it actually is.
And by the way, if we had stayed and listened to him, we'd still be in lockdown and there'd be a bit more waiting list, right, Mr. Speaker? But actually right now, there are record levels of cancer treatment as we catch up with those missed things. But he talks about what's terrifying, Mr. Speaker. What's terrifying is right now. What's terrifying is that right now, people not knowing whether when they call 999, they will get the treatment that they need.
And whose fault is that?
Now, Mr. Speaker, in Australia and Canada and the US, they ban strikes on blue light services. We're not doing that. All we're saying is that in these emergency services, patients should be able to rely on a basic level of life-saving care. Why is he against that, Mr. Speaker?
Again, it's not Leader of the Opposition questions, it's Prime Minister's question. So
there's not a minimum level of service any day because they've broken the NHS.
Perfect answer.
He's not promising that people will get to see a doctor in a few days like they did under Labour. He's not promising that cancer patients would get urgent treatment as they did under Labour. He's not even promising an NHS that puts patients first like it did under Labour. No, he's promising that one day, although we can't say when, their record high waiting list will stop growing. And that's it. After 13 years in government, what does it say? But the best they can offer is that at some point they might stop making things worse.
Yeah. Right, Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the NHS, it's crystal clear. The Conservatives on the side of patients, Labour on the side
of... He's just completely separated from reality. People think that I am because I believe in magic, but my fundamentals come from science and history. This guy's in a completely different universe, it seems.
Of their union paymasters. Mr. Speaker, I've laid out my priorities for the country. Waiting list down, inflation down, debt down, growth.
Right. Inflation is going to come down by itself. And if it's going to do that, then hopefully the Bank of England will then lower the interest rates. Still not going to make things much better. Not only that, but it's already forecast. So it's not your win, mate. It's not nothing. It's nothing you've done. Fucking lying little prick.
Up and the boats stop, Mr. Speaker. All he does is flip from one thing to another, and that's the difference between him and me. He's focused on petty politics. I'm delivering for Britain.
Really? Then why is it we've barely fucking seen you? Why is it that still nothing is being done? Why is it that still the strikes are going on, despite the fact of your little promise that you get the strikes stopped? You haven't, because you don't want them stopped. You want a bogeyman to beat. He needs to be brought up for lying in Parliament.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of my constituents in Truro and Falmouth, actually, I would like to thank all of the health and social care professions in Cornwall for all of the hard work they're doing in a particularly difficult winter. In Cornwall, we don't get any respite in the summer because everybody comes to Cornwall for their holidays, which is brilliant. But so there is no respite in the summer or the winter for our health and social care professionals. And in addition to that, Mr. Speaker, when we're trying to recruit people into social care, which is a vocation, they are competing with hospitality. And I would like to ask my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, whether he is aware of these extra challenges that places like Cornwall face in recruitment and retention.
Well, we have the same problem here in Devon. In Torbay, we have the same problem. And what's the MP doing about it? Absolutely fuck all.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to shine a spotlight, and I share with her and be incredibly proud of all our social care workers for the commitment that they have to their profession. And that's why...
Then why have you fucking not supported them? Why is there no plan to bring the social care sector in under the NHS? so that people aren't paying out their fucking arse. Why is there no recruitment? Why is there no training for the social care sector?
Many of them will
so little of it.
spring from an almost 10% increase in the national living wage, putting an extra £1,600 in their pay slips, but also we want to make sure that they feel valued with correct professional development, training and career progression, and the £500 million investment we're putting into the social care workforce will do exactly that for hers and other workers.
We now come to the leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, the longest and deepest recession in the entire G7. Brexit, 13 years of Tory rule, the energy price crisis, inflation and interest rates. If the people of Scotland are to do the maths, as the Prime Minister so hopes, will they not come to the conclusion that this union simply doesn't add up?
Well, I'm pleased the honourable gentleman brought up energy, and he's right to do that, because energy, and when it comes to the economy, is incredibly important to Scotland's energy, and actually Scotland will play a fantastic part in helping us transition to net zero. But what we do now know is that the Scottish Government don't want to support Scottish energy industry and the 200,000 jobs that it produces. I'm keen to work with the Scottish Government to support the North Sea, because it's something that we're all very proud of in the United Kingdom.
But Mr. Speaker, if he wants to talk about the fact that Scotland is energy rich but fuel poor on Westminster's watch, I am more than happy to do so. But for today, let's reflect upon numbers, and in particular those numbers which were shone a light on by Sam Coates of Sky, in particular those in relation to the Prime Minister's favourite potential successor, which showed that over the course of 4 months, from 4 speeches, he raked in excess of £1 million. Does the Prime Minister not find it utterly perverse that senior members of the Conservative Party are feathering their nest in this way, whilst at the same time seeking to deny working people the opportunity to strike for fair pay?
Yes, Stephen Flynn. Fucking right, son. Bang on.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think we need to talk about our predecessors, but I remember,
yeah, because we know what they did. They helped fuck us up.
I think it was one of his predecessors that did indeed work for Russia Today, if I'm not mistaken. But what I would say is, he talks about the priorities. You know, yesterday the SNP spent time talking yet more about independence.
Alright, Mr. Sunak, if you want to go down that fucking route, what about you being one of the big wigs, well, not the big, one of the big wigs, but you know, not a little bit of the puzzle when it came to the financial crash. Who were you working for? Oh, that's right, Deutsche Bank. One of the banks that majorly fucked up.
At a time when we should be talking about...
He was working for it at the time.
Delivering for people across the United Kingdom, focusing on their jobs, improving the NHS across the UK, in Scotland as indeed as in everywhere else. That's the kind of thing I want to talk to the Scottish Government about, and I hope that he'll work with me to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Conservative governments have a proud record of supporting the UK steel industry. So can I thank my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, for the work that he has already done for steel. He will know that steel is a vital strategic industry. It is essential for everything we do, from defence to growth. So can I ask him, will he do everything he can to ensure that we're always able to make steel in this country? And does he agree with me that steel is always safest under a Conservative government?
And how do you make
Mr.
that?
Speaker, my honourable friend is a fantastic champion for the steel industry and this government.
I'm sorry, it's bullshit. Again, the steel industry did not want this new fucking mine, and yet this so-called steel industry friendly government went against that. It's just complete contradictions, complete hypocrisy is what it fucking is.
Remains committed to a thriving UK steel industry. That's why our support for steel includes almost £800 million in relief for electricity costs, and steel companies are eligible to bid for up to £1.5 billion in capital grants to speed their transition to net zero steel production.
This settles off.
I'm sure the whole House will wish to join me in wishing all the best to Gareth Bale, the former captain of the Wales men's soccer team, who's been a national inspiration and took Wales to the Football World Cup. This Tory government attacks dedicated health and ambulance staff, but disruption from strikes is as nothing compared with the chronic disruption caused every day by their 13 years butchering of health budgets. Meanwhile, Labour's Health Secretary in Wales follows the Tory playbook, blaming patients themselves for the standards of their health. But the reality is this: health service.
Interesting. Independent parties seem to be getting a bigger word. I'm hearing more from them.
Services in Wales suffer from a combination of mismanagement by Labour and a Westminster funding system which perpetuates poverty.
Yeah, indeed.
Levelling.
Prime Minister. Far too long. The Prime Minister must have got.
Will you therefore commit to public?
Prime Minister, you can't go on forever, Liz.
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, let me join with the Honourable Lady as a Southampton fan. Gareth Bale, also a hero of mine as well, and I wish him well. But when it comes to funding Wales, it's as a result of the funding from Barnet that the Welsh Government receives around significantly more funding than the NHS in England, but also £1.2 billion of extra funding as a result of the autumn statement. And what I said to the Leader of the Opposition, this isn't about actually political point scoring. The NHS is under pressure in Wales, as it is in Scotland and in England, in large part because of the impact of a global pandemic.
Again, these problems were starting to happen before the pandemic happened. Stop denying actual history here.
And she would do.
It's not like it was that fucking long ago.
To recognise that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, unlike parties opposite, including the Scottish National Party and even the member for Aberdeen South, I know my right honourable friend supports or recognises the critical role that oil and gas companies.
I'm just not going to, what I want to see is it doesn't seem like there's anything particularly interesting to happen here.
That's what we're focused on doing, and that's what our plans will deliver.
Right, that completes Prime Minister's questions. We'll
get a bit of the analysis, and then I'll end the video.
That concludes Prime Minister's questions, the first of the year. We're going to discuss it in just a moment with our political editor, Beth Rigby. But first, a quick update on the story we've been bringing you all morning in terms of flights in the US. The Federal Aviation Administration issued quite astonishing delay. All departures for a good hour or so more to come, at least. The Transport Secretary in the US, Pete Buttigieg, is also...
About healthcare, when I spoke to Angela Rayner, the Deputy Labour leader, yesterday and asked her what she thought...
...touch with the FAA this morning about the outage, and that the FAA is working to resolve the issue swiftly and safely. They'll continue to provide updates, as will we, on that story. But let's pivot back to PMQs. Beth, with me here on set, and unsurprisingly focus on NHS and strikes to start with for Keir Starmer. A lot of catchy zingers from both sides without any kind of real progress on anything fundamental.
Absolutely lively PMQs there with quite spirited performances from both men, actually, on the state of the NHS and their respective plans for it, all the respective defence and criticism. But what was really interesting in this PMQs was right at the top of the hour, the Prime Minister has now answered the question that he has been avoiding for weeks about his own personal situation in terms of private healthcare. He was asked repeatedly about it by Laura Koonsberg at the BBC on Sunday in an interview. He refused to answer the question. He said it wasn't relevant if he used private healthcare. When I spoke to Angela Rayner, the Deputy Labour leader, yesterday and asked her what she thought, she said it's up to him if he does it, but he should come clean with the public. And there at PMQs at the top of the hour, perhaps anticipating he was going to be pressed upon it again by Keir Starmer, he gave the answer that Number 10 have been trying to not give for weeks and weeks. And he said, I am registered with an NHS GP. I have used independent healthcare in the past. So that's actually a piece of news of something the Prime Minister wanted to avoid answering, but just did at PMQs there. In terms of what...
So what, was it indeed a private thing, or was he just embarrassed that he no longer uses the that he uses NHS?
Discussion was around the NHS. There were two attack lines really from Starmer. The first was describing it as the greatest crisis in the history of NHS, taking aim at the Prime Minister again for not resolving nurses' strikes, saying he could have done this before Christmas. Instead, he's chosen to prolong the misery. And then the second...
That was, in all of this, Sunak's biggest mistake is not going to not going to negotiate with the nurses when they offered it before Geola. Offered it even before winter solstice. So,
sort of line of questioning from Starmer was on strike laws, actually going in there and actually tackling that head on, and using a catchline I think we will see a lot, where he said, when I clap the nurses, you are sacking the nurses, and arguing that this will not help resolve the crisis in the NHS. But equally, Rishi Sunak there was pretty robust in his rebuttals, saying again that he had to be responsible with the public finances in terms of pay awards, and also criticising some of the measures that the Labour Party have suggested for the NHS. Specifically, he criticised Labour for their unfunded, as he put it, plans for reform. Now, I asked Angie Rain yesterday if she thought that the Labour Party should put additional money into the NHS. The Conservatives put an additional £6.6 billion in funding over the next 2 years. Is it enough? Many healthcare professionals say it's not. Now, Labour are talking about not more money, but reform. Now, he attacked their plan, saying that the plan to buy out GP contracts, and he quoted the independent health tank Nuffield Trust, would cost a fortune and was out of date. And then the zinger from Sunak there was, he said, out of date, costing a fortune, just like the Labour Party. But then, of course, as you said, there were some good lines too from Keir Starmer when Rishi Sunak criticised Keir Starmer for not supporting the strike laws guarantee minimum service levels, which the Conservatives are trying to push through. Starmer shot straight back. There's not a minimum level of service any day in the NHS because they have broken the NHS. So really spirited exchanges from those two men there. And it doesn't feel like in any way that these rows over the NHS are going to go away, particularly when we have ambulance strikes today. There are more nurses strikes scheduled. That doesn't seem to be resolved. And now junior doctors also balloting for strikes. The health secretary couldn't meet them today, but we understand he's going to try and meet them soon.
And Starmer also, in response to Sunak's jab about the Labour Party broadly, said of the Conservatives, scratch the surface and you realise there's nothing there. Lots of zingers throughout. One of them from Sunak, very quickly, so I know we're out of time, Beth, came after a specific mention from Stephen Flynn, the Westminster leader of SNP, name-checking the Westminster Accounts, Sky News' project, and Sam Coates in particular, and referenced Boris Johnson's £1 million or so earnings over the last 4 months for speeches, and Sunak had a good riposte.
Well, yeah, that was so Stephen Flynn, the new Westminster leader of the SNP, praising the Westminster Accounts project for shining a light on where the money goes in Westminster and using it to attack Sunak over Johnson's 1 million of earnings. And he said he did actually kill it dead quite effectively, saying, I'm not going to take lectures from a man whose predecessor, Alex Salmond, took money from Russia Today, the media organisation.
Yeah, so it's advising him it's not worth either of us talking about our predecessors, which was a clever reply. Well worth either way checking the Westminster Accounts project on Sky News. Beth, as always, thanks so much for...
Is it though? Because the Boris Johnson stuff is still current, even though it's already happened, it is technically past. Because of the investigation and stuff, it is still current. Whereas the Alex Salmond stuff is done. Russia Today doesn't work for Russia Today anymore. They don't take money from Russia Today. And it was also a point where Russia Today was looked at as trusted, even by the Tories. You can go out there and find plenty of Tories who say, oh, you can trust Russia Today. You can trust Russia Today. So who's being fucking flippy floppy now? Sunak. So I don't think that was as much of a zinger as dickhead thinks it is. Don't get me wrong. I think it's kind of does put the Stephen Flynn on the back foot, but again, the Boris Johnson stuff is still current. He's taking the piss right now. So, I'm not sure the same thing will be applied. But anyway, this has been my reaction to first PMQs of the Christian year. It being today, hang on a second. Bloody hell, where am I? The 19th of Areola. I should be able to do this already, but yeah, the 17th of Areola, 19th of Areola makes it the 11th of January. And I do hope that people have a good one this year. It's gonna be different. Oh no. Yeah, I was right. But yeah, this is where we're at. I'm not sure, but like I said, I'm not sure that was that Sunak was as strong as this guy. As the guy said he was. Could be my own bias, but I was able to tear holes into his arguments straight away. Whereas Starmer was coming out with stuff that when Sunak tried to argue against it, it was like, well, you're arguing with the actual fact, you dickhead. So well done. But yeah, just being Shadow Eater, one angry pagan, and I do hope you guys come back to watch more of my videos. Please like, comment, subscribe. Please comment. I like comments. But yeah, blessed Thursday everyone, and have a good day. Goodbye.